Good morning to everyone. Welcome to this webinar organised by Landor Links and supported by Padam Mobility as part of Landor's Public Transport Recovery Series. My name's John Taylor. I'm a director of the Task Partnership, and I think the reason that I'm chairing it is that I've been involved in various aspects of demand responsive transport for the past 40 years. The webinar is entitled New Opportunities for Demand Responsive Transport, and it's extremely timely as shown by the large attendance this morning. We've got some 350 delegates booked in. Governments across the UK are putting great store in the potential for DRT to make a significant improvement in both rural and suburban transport offers. A variety of new services are being funded. In Scotland, the continuing rollout of flexi services in Wales, and here in England, both the Rural Mobility Fund and the strong aspirations for DRT set out in the National Bus Strategy. And yet the track record for both urban and rural DRT services in the UK since the 1970s is extremely poor. They certainly fall into the high risk investment category. There are nevertheless a few success stories, one of which, Lincolnshire, we will be hearing more about shortly. So the question arises whether the latest technology developments can actually make enough of a difference to achieve the shift to supported sustainability that we need. And this is a particular challenge in rural areas where a scattered population offers fundamental difficulties in pulling together the necessary collective demand. But even with the technology, we need to understand what the differences were between success and failure in past services and apply that to the design of new services. As a webinar chair, I'm in the fortunate position of no longer having to tell you where the fire exits are and to turn off your mobile phones. This means we can focus on content. We've got a 90-minute window, which is a very tight schedule. We have 4 speakers, followed by a panel discussion, which will be joined by 2 local authority practitioners. To keep to time, we're going to hold questions until the panel session. Please use the questions function to pose the questions that you want the panel to consider. The speakers will be switching their video microphones on and off as they come to contribute. So our first speaker is Jamie Cole, Deputy Head of Local Passenger Transport Division. This is a new handle because the department has gone through a recent reorganisation. Following a 20-year career in passenger transport, primarily with Transport for London, Jamie has taken on the very significant challenge of becoming, amongst other things, the department's Mr. DRT. So I'm sure that we will all be listening very closely to understand how the DFT views the future for DRT. Over to you, Jamie.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can both see and hear me. Thanks for that introduction, John. So yeah, I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes talking to you about the Rural Mobility Fund, which hopefully many of you will be already familiar with, the relationship between DRT and our National Bus Strategy, and also the work that we've been doing with Future of Transport. So next slide, please. First thing to say about Rural Mobility Fund is it was launched by the Prime Minister back in 2019 as part of the Better Deal for Bus Users. It's a £20 million fund that's basically seeking to trial DRT in both rural and suburban areas to understand whether it can work better for local residents than traditional timetable services. We're looking at naturally trying to understand better the role of DRT in improving access to services. We're also very much interested in its role, particularly in rural areas, to improve social inclusion, reduce isolation, and we are keen to make sure that we're exploring service provisions that attract a diverse customer base, maybe slightly different from some of the traditional dial-a-ride services that have been in existence in the past. And the whole scheme should hopefully, if each of the pilots are successful, should lead to modal shift, and we're hoping that that in itself provides a contribution to the government's wider contribution to climate change, or reducing the effects of climate change. So we launched a competition back in February last year to provide local transport authorities with the opportunity to bid for a share of the £20 million pot. We received 56 bids, which shows the level of interest across the country. And of those, we selected the 17 strongest bids from 15 local authorities to take forwards. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, on the left-hand side, you can see a list of the local authorities that have secured the funding that they bid for. And as you can see, it ranges from approximately 600k all the way up to 1.5 million. And probably worth highlighting that many of these schemes will also be receiving match funding from the local authorities themselves, or maybe some financial input from local business. Then on the right hand side, you can see the distribution of the bids, which is those in green, and the ones that were successful in securing a share of the £20 million pot. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So just to take you through some of the features of these pilots. As I say, there's 17 of them, and whilst they have been they were chosen based on their own individual merits. Naturally, there's quite a wide variety of different opportunities for learning. So as you can see by some of the illustrations on screen, we're very much interested in the role that DRT can have in improving access to healthcare, such as local hospitals, to home to school and home to daycare services, wider educational access, as well as connecting people better to onward transportation, whether it be simply connecting to the local train stations, or in the case of Essex, connecting to London Stansted Airport. It's also worth highlighting that some of the schemes are looking to improve access to destinations in themselves. So you've got a picture there of Delamere Forest in Cheshire. Likewise, the Peak District National Park features in one of the schemes, not to mention many others. We're also interested in its role potentially to improve access to work. So many of the schemes not just link up people in rural areas to a local market town, for example. They also provide an opportunity to improve links to local business parks, industrial parks, and enterprise zones. They also, in some of the schemes, I think Buckinghamshire, for example, link very closely to commitments to build new housing and provide an opportunity potentially to improve service provision at very early stages of the growth of a new part of a town. Worth highlighting also that two of the schemes are trialling electric buses, that's Surrey and Essex, so it'd be very interesting to understand what role that has to play, and whether it introduces additional barriers that maybe aren't so much true of conventional diesel fueled minibuses. Also, some of the schemes have taken or are proposing taking on a sort of, shall I say, a high-end approach, and with, for example, providing leather seats, Wi-Fi, access to USB charging. And it'll be interesting for us to understand whether those influence demand levels, or whether they're nothing much more than a gimmick. One other thing to flag is that the scheme that's being proposed in Cumbria is taking the total transport concept to possibly a slightly different level, in the sense that they're interested in trialling non-passenger transportation using the services, either through the delivery of pharmaceuticals, library books, or parcels to local residents. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of the range of different features that we're interested in testing through this fund. Next slide, please. So the National Bus Strategy, as John mentioned at the start, hopefully you're all familiar with the fact that we launched our National Bus Strategy, Bus Back Better, in March, setting out an ambitious plan for how we intend to make bus services in England faster, cheaper, easier to use, and more broadly, better for our customers. It's worth highlighting the fact that DRT features heavily. I think the word is mentioned at least 30 times in the document. So it's clear that it is that the government sees DRT as performing a role going forward. But it is also important that I highlight a comment that's in the document, which states that we don't believe DRT is the perfect solution for every scenario. It has a role to play, but there are circumstances where DRT will not provide the solution that maybe traditional timetabled services may well do. Just as an aside, highlighting the main thrust of the strategy is the concept of improving partnership working between local transport authorities and bus operators. And a key feature is that we are expecting local authorities and bus operators to commit to entering an enhanced partnership or pursuing franchising arrangements in order to continue to access emergency COVID funding and, in the future, transformational funding. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the government committed to funding improvements in bus services to the tune of £3 billion. And in order for operators and local authorities to continue to be sort of around the table for accessing that funding, we expect them to be committing to some form of partnership arrangement. To kick that off, we have set a deadline at the end of October for LTAs working with bus operators to set out their plans in terms of bus service improvement plans. The other things to mention is we've made a commitment in there to launch a bus centre of excellence to improve learning and understanding in the industry, and it may well be the case that DRT features there as an approach that maybe not all local transport authorities or bus operators are fully familiar with. So there's an opportunity for everyone involved to share learning in that space. Also worth saying that there is a clear commitment in the strategy to build on the Rural Mobility Fund and consider expanding on our learning there. Next slide, please. And finally, just to say that my colleagues working in the future of transport world have been very busy over the past years and continue to be so in terms of exploring how better to harness new innovation. So back in March 2019, we published an urban strategy for future mobility, which is available on the government's website. Linked to that, a future mobility rural strategy will be published in the future, and our call for evidence for that was open until February this year, and very soon we hope to publish a summary of the outcomes of that. And then the final point is to say that we undertook a call for evidence also on regulatory review, which was published last year, a summary of those responses. And again, what we're interested in with that is understanding how existing regulations work well for new innovation, including DRT, where there's opportunities for making changes to regulations, to do more to exploit the opportunities that new innovations such as DRT provide. That's all I have for you this morning, so thank you ever so much for your time. I will hand back to John now to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Jamie. That was really helpful and sets the context for the discussions to come. Our next speaker is David Carnero. When he's not heading down mountains at speed on a mountain bike, he's responsible for international business development for Padam International, which, as you will no doubt hear, offers one of the latest DRT software platforms, which is in operation in a number of locations around the world. And I think he's probably of interest because of the integration links that they have with conventional public and community transport. So, David, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And unfortunately, I'm nowhere near as fast as I used to be on a mountain bike, but I think that's just the aging process. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Today, I'm going to be talking about the opportunity for DRT. I'm going to look at two aspects. One is the now, very concrete, and in fact, discuss or share in terms of discussions that we're having at the moment with various local authorities and operators, but also look to the future as well. And through those discussions, we're finding that there's quite a clear path in terms of ideas of where to go. So I want to share a little bit on that as well. So next slide, please. So I'm David Carnero. I am British, although I live in France. And I'm responsible for international business development at Padam Mobility. I'm a lead for the UK market and have been here for roughly 7 months. We've already gone through an acquisition, or we've been acquired in that time. So some news that came out very recently is Siemens have bought us. So things have changed in the very short time I've been here. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're going to start with today, and that's going to focus on rural mobility, rural DRT. But then we're going to look at what's been discussed in terms of where it goes, and that falls into the guise what I'm going to call integrated transport here, and then further along the line moves into mass. So we'll cover those three topics in a little bit of detail. Next slide, please. So in terms of rural mobility, this is, as Jamie said, DRT isn't the answer for every scenario, but rural mobility we feel is one where DRT is a very strong answer. And I'm going to go through that a little bit here. So really the focus is on improving rural connectivity. We know this is a problem, there are many different levels, not least financial. In terms of operating a commercial service. So what we're going to do is look at some of the discussions, some of the thoughts, and also some of the interesting points that have come out with our discussions with local authorities on rural DRT. As Jamie has said again, this does fit into very well into the national part of the national bus strategy. It also fits into other industry initiatives or government initiatives such as Bus Back Better and also enhanced partnerships, as we've heard. So in terms of Padam Mobility, we've talked to almost all the county councils that have won and a number of those that didn't. And some of the interesting points that we've gleaned from these discussions and also that we've seen elsewhere in Europe where we operate is that DRT really is strongest in a rural or peri-urban environment. We'd go as far as saying that DRT, in terms of our philosophy, isn't suited to a city centre, as in a free-floating city centre DRT service. We believe there's no need to add another transport layer on top of what's already available. But in the rural or peri-urban, of course, there's a a distinct lack of transport options. So through the Rural Mobility Fund, what we found is that DRT can help with things like modal shift, air pollution, accessibility, isolation. So isolation in the context of the current pandemic and the effect that's had, but also in terms of policy of getting to education, getting to work, and also getting to health facilities. So in our discussions, what we believe is very important on the Rural Mobility Fund is, and given that it's a trial in a way to see the impact of DRT in this environment, one of the most important things is to clearly define what you want to get out of it at the beginning, and have very clear KPIs that can be measured against. So this is, we're working quite a lot with the various authorities on defining this. We, through discussions again, what we've come up with is to actually launch simple and simple/small. So the goal is to remove complexity. This is particularly important in the cases where DRT isn't an existing service, so it's a new service. And what we'll find is that it's going to be a testing and an iterative process. We believe it's going to be 9 to 12 months before the actual DRT service is bedded in. And by that, I mean with the patronage growth that we'd want to see, et cetera, et cetera. There will be changes, tweaks that are possible. So the whole of that process, the first 9 to 12 months, the advice is focus on DRT, keep it simple, and learn, test, and iterate. And then when you have that database there, or that data layer, if you like, then is how we can, look forward. And that's something that seems to, well, it comes from the local authorities, but also resonates with the local authorities. So next slide, please. So in terms of where we can go, once we've gone through that initial 9 to 12 month period, a lot of the discussions we're having is then about integrated transport. And this comes in 3 main topics. So the ability to plan multimodal journeys on public transport network, and that's obviously integrating the DRT service with the structural transport network. What's the place for mobile ticketing, and what do we do with mobile ticketing? And then last of all, so moving on from the keep it simple at the beginning, and part of that keep it simple is actually the fare structure. But then thoughts really move to, well, how do we evolve the service? And in evolving the service, how do we evolve the fare management to be able to deliver zonal fares and also distance-based fares? And that's both for full fare paying passengers and concessionary travel. Next slide, please. So here, what I wanted to do was just show an example of where we have an integrated transport approach that's live today. We are going to go across the channel to France, to Lille. It's the closest I could find. And here you have on the right is a service that's live today. That's integrated with the public transport network at Lille. And you can see there is a journey that's being showed on the journey planner. The first part is a fixed line bus, and then the second part is the option is to take a DRT. In this instance, now I'm not going to go into too much technical stuff, but not in the 10 minutes. But in this instance, what we have is what we call deep linking. So here, the DRT journey is incorporated into the overall journey, but the way of booking it is either by calling into a call center or to then link out to either a website or a mobile app, which will be our DRT mobile app in this instance. So what this does is it really integrates DRT within the overall transport network. And we're hearing this a lot as a requirement or where the local authorities want to go with the, let's take the Rural Mobility Fund, although it's not exclusively the Rural Mobility Funds. Next slide, please. And then, so once that's been done, then a topic we're hearing as well, which has been complicated in the UK versus other markets, but is the goal to get to mass. And again, on the technical front, two ways that we do this today, so I always want to talk about what we're doing today, is deep linking. So we've seen that in the integrated transport, but there is also the possibility to have a fully integrated DRT service. And what that means is it's not just the journey planning that showed in the other application, in this case the mass application, but it's the ability to book the journey in real time, to have ticketing, and to incorporate that into a bigger journey, or a multimodal journey. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So why are we talking about mass? And our perspective is very clear on this. We actually feel that mass doesn't deliver on its promise unless DRT is a part of it. And what I mean by that is the private-public aspects of mass, whether that's public transport, micromobility, taxis, etc., they do deliver on a lot of promises, but some parts of the communities are left behind. In particular, accessibility is one where there's a question mark, and we believe that DRT really does provide a solution for that within mass. It's on demand, it's up to real-time on demand, it's shared transportation, it's a public transport service, but it obviously caters for people who have reduced mobility. Low-income groups, again, micromobility is great. I've used it a lot in Paris, but it is expensive versus public transport, and low-income groups, it can be inaccessible. So we feel that a DRT that's integrated into the public transport policy, and by that I mean also pricing, can be very accessible to low-income groups as a form of shared mobility. The youth, that's also another part. This will be in a rural environment rather than an urban environment, obviously. But we have done DRT projects where 85% of the patronage was youth, because there really was a hole in terms of how they could get about in a rural environment. And that's both for school and also extracurricular activities as well. And then again, in a rural environment, in terms of on-demand shared mobility, we feel that DRT is a major answer to the problem that is rural mobility. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So it seems to be not moving on my screen anyway.
David, can I suggest you keep going?
Okay, yeah, I think so. Okay, so we'll do it freestyle without some slides. So continuing on the mass discussion, and again, just going into a bit of research here, and it's within this peri-urban or rural environment that we've been discussing, so that's the focus here. So what we can state is in the UK specifically, over half of the working age population have a low access to public transport. And this comes from a study that was conducted in 2019, Inequalities in Mobility and Access in the UK Transport System by the Government Office for Science. And it actually is 57% of the population live in areas with low access to public transport. Now, what this means, obviously, in terms of going into the topic of modal shift, it means that really the option for people is to take their own car, and this is absolutely what we want to avoid. Again, another statistic that I've come across is that for the city of Manchester, 30% of rush hour traffic comes from a rural origin. So this really, for me, encapsulates the problem here. It's that there is poor access to public transport for sometimes valid reasons, but it has a domino effect on the congestion, on the pollution in a big city and urban environment such as Manchester. Next slide, please. So I think you've done it. Actually, stay there. That's the one. No, go back one, please. And that's it. Now, what I'm going to go through here is actually an example of a complex DRT service or a large-scale DRT service in Paris. It's a little tongue-in-cheek in terms of demand-responsive transport, a mass within mass. But what we're trying to show here is that DRT is very flexible. You can have lots of different services, DRT services, as we know, whether that's free-floating, whether that's feeder services into a train station or a bus station, whether it's access to a town or city centre for specific amenities such as health or leisure or sports, etc. And what we're trying to say here is, or what hopefully we'll say here is, that this can be done on a county-wide basis. It can be done on, I'm going to show, a regional basis, and actually correlates to lots of the flexibility of DRT and how you can solve the problem where the structural transport network isn't the answer. So here we have two scenarios. Sorry?
1 minute.
Yep. Here we have two scenarios. So one where well, in terms of our speak, it's called the multi-territory approach. So you have a region where you have different territories which serve different purposes, and even can have different vehicle configurations versus the volume of bookings, etc., etc. But also you can have multiple territories within one service, and this is what we're going to show on the next slide very briefly. So on the next slide, hopefully, yeah, we'll have a map. So this is the Greater Paris region, and this is where DRT fills the hole that's in the structural transport network all around the Paris network. So today it's 21 DRT zones. This feeds into 39 train stations. It's comprised of 67 vehicles, and the platform is geared up to deliver 60,000 passenger trips per month. This isn't where it's going to stay. In the future, it will grow to 40 DRT zones, so pretty much doubling. So as you can see, DRT can be a real answer in the rural peri-urban environment for problems that are not solved with the structural transport network. Back to you, John. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I want to move on to Beate Kubitz, who is a consultant with Future Mobility. I commend her website. It's an extremely wide and fascinating portfolio of new mobility schemes that she's involved with, including last mile delivery, bike sharing, and mobility as a service. And she's also an advocate for Todmorden, so clearly into transport for the north in a big way. Beate's going to tell us about the results of the recent survey into DRT issues undertaken for this webinar. Beate.
Thank you, John. My interest in this is as a FIT Fellow, Foundation for Integrated Transport Fellow for this year, where my research is looking at a scheme, looking at how access to transport affects car trip generation into city centres, and seeing, the analysis so far indicates that we're generating quite a lot of car trips from rural areas and areas that are not well connected into city centres, and getting this island city kind of approach. If you looked at the map of Paris that David showed, the centre of Paris is beautifully laid out for public transport. It's got great bike sharing schemes. It's got all sorts of amazing things. But once you move beyond the boundaries of the city of Paris and into the Ile-de-France, then you have much less public transport until DRT has started to fill some of those gaps. So So this work's looking at that kind of relationship and how we can potentially solve it. Padam Mobility kindly gave me access to case studies and helped present to the call for evidence on for future of transport on rural mobility as well. So I've done a little bit of work with them on that. The survey on DRT that we launched last month was very much about getting a snapshot of what's going on at the moment and what people's hopes and aspirations for DRT are in the UK. It was predominantly a UK audience who completed the survey. So 44% of the people who responded to the survey had either run a DRT scheme or were currently running one. And those existing DRT services that we have in the UK at the moment are very much a mixture of very diverse services. I was quite surprised, and I managed to get a lot of other answers. So we had a lot of people who were doing community transport, which was expected, patient transport, and flexible fixed route buses with diversions for pickups and drop-offs. But we were also getting, all sorts of other services, predominantly run on minibuses, the 15 to 25 seaters. We were seeing over a third though on cars. I think some were mixed fleet, 26% on the slightly bigger buses, the single deckers, and then the over 25 seaters, a small percentage on those. So a very varied fleet. And organised in lots of different ways, and this is where it was quite interesting, because I had not put in paper and pen and forms as one of my potential responses, but we had quite a few quite low tech ways of organising fleets at the moment, using some still quite, over a third using dynamic DRT software, the kind of contemporary platform-based software like the Padam Mobility that David's been talking about, but also people using their own experience, digital maps, pens and paper, a few courier platforms, a few of the other social transport platforms that have come about, the flexi buses and the driver-nets of the world. But still, we were seeing 20% nearly that were using things that I hadn't considered, to be absolutely frank. And booking, again, that lots and lots of people are using phone calls to book DRT in the UK at the moment, to book, community transport, patient transport, and different sorts of flexible services. There are some websites, there are some forms, and quite a high number are booked on app. But we're also getting still things that just recur. They just happen week after week, so there isn't really a way of booking them other than a form maybe a long time ago, and paper and pencil, people dropping in, telling receptionists and things like that. So there's quite informal ways of booking the forms. So this is a snapshot of where we are, and the thing that I asked people who had organised or were organising TRT is what their main challenges were. So on the next slide, we have the ranking of what the challenges were, and possibly unsurprisingly, the highest ranking challenge for those running DRT at the moment is cost. And service coverage was not a consideration, because you can design these services, so that's good. But yeah, that cost was the highest ranking challenge for those running DRT. So we've got a flavour of a very mixed, quite diverse set of services that are quite expensive to run. When we move on to the expectations that people have of DRT, the bigger group of people who responded to the survey, we have lots more. If I could have the following slides just to show people what the priorities people were looking at. So people were thinking that very much it's about convenience for users, and this is a question I asked several times in different ways to try and draw out different nuances in people's expectations. But the answers came back and they were very, very blunt, that basically DRT is seen as extending services, reaching different customer groups, providing services close to people, so that the point of origin, people have transport from the point of origin to the point of destination, not just optimizing services. And there's an element of this where I'm slightly concerned, because the potential for making efficiencies and designing networks that are efficient, and it seems to not have been really jumped on by people responding to the survey. I asked people about funding expectations, and happily only 6% would actually expect a DRT to require funding to make a surplus. Nearly a third would think that the DRT that they would anticipate would be self-funding, but well over a half expect DRT to attract subsidy, which is kind of to be expected in some ways, because DRT are seen as a rural solution. Rural transport often requires subsidy, so that's not concerning in some respects. Then we have a look. Then we also thinking about the way that people could connect with buses, because I think this is where DRT has had problems in the past. Those high costs have been a challenge for DRT, and the business model has been difficult to justify. I've seen total transport schemes that have been great and attracted lots more people, but have not extended beyond the end of the schemes. So building that business case is important, but people are still expecting that DRT will, at least 20% of people are saying they're only going to, it's only going to reach areas currently not served, and and another 40% connecting to make it connect to fixed bus routes. Only 38% saying it may replace some fixed bus routes, and I think fortunately nobody thinks it should replace all fixed bus routes, so that's positive. But I think my reflection, and this is an initial sift of the survey responses, there's still quite a lot still to come out from it, and you're welcome to sign up at the end to get a full copy of the report. That my reflection is that we are at a point where we have the new national bus strategy, we have enhanced partnerships and franchising as potential ways of assisting local authorities and operators to design areas, and we have lots and lots of potential for DRT to expand the market, and maybe in some instances in the French examples that I looked at, DRT was used to expand a market, and then fixed routes were put in because it got to a point where they would be sustainable. And then, so I'm very excited to see that we've got a bus centre of excellence, and we could actually really have a chance to look at optimising routes and creating excellent networks, and maybe being a little bit more sharp on the business model and making sure that we do have DRT, that it works for people, that it connects people to services, but also that it's a way of optimising an overall network. I think this is the opportunity we have with the National Bus Strategy, and I really hope that we can see that happening. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Beate. I think your comment there on the need to get the business models sharper is completely opposite to our current position. So moving on rapidly, our next speaker is Dr. Patrizia Franco, who's a principal demand modeler at the Connected Places Catapult. I see that, why is she here? She chose to be a transport engineer when she was 5, and her dad used to take her to construction sites, which gave her a wow experience. So we're very glad about that. She's going to talk to us about a Catapult project called Assets, which has been considering the role of big data in rural transport services development. Over to you, Patrizia.
Thank you, John. Interesting bio. So today we're going to speak about assessing sustainable transport solution for rural mobility, which is a project which has been funded by the Office for Science and developed in collaboration with the Future of Transport team, which Jamie mentioned in his presentation. Next slide, please. The project looked at improving accessibility and transport solution in rural environments by increasing the knowledge base around demand for new mobility services. We usually, the Department for Transport run a series of roundtables organized by the University of Hertfordshire, and many stakeholders say there is not enough demand for travel in rural areas. So we can't cater for new mobility services because they will not generate an appetite in the rural communities. So the approach that we took with the Future of Transport team was looking at identifies new ways to remove the barriers which prevent new mobility services that are commercially viable, that could be commercially viable in rural areas, using a data-driven approach and understanding the typical travel patterns that you might have in rural areas. And we've done so looking at different alternative data sources which are not commonly used to describe the travel patterns. We looked at mobile network data aggregated trip change level, and we also explored tailored intervention, asking the residents what they would like to see on the market and what the mobility services provider they think about the services that they're running. And finally, we conclude the work looking at business scales and what might work in rural areas, and what the adaptation measure that you might need to put in place in rural areas. So the project look at innovative transport. Yes, you can move to the next slide. Look at innovative transport solution, not just demand responsive transport, but demand responsive transport is key for this project as well. So when we developed the data landscape for rural communities, we assessed the data availability, the existing data landscape. We acquired new data sets at trip change level, still anonymized and aggregated, but an higher spatial and temporal granularity compared to what is available on the market. The trip chains allow us to understand all the intermediate trips and how the travel patterns change over the 24 hours. So we have a very good understanding of what residents are doing during an average day. Specifically, we acquired data for March 2019. And also we look at the traditional way of assessing rural mobility and providing for mobility services for these areas, which is mainly based on minimum population density, and if this is still valid when we look at on-demand shared mobility. Next slide, please. During the project, we looked at 3 specific case studies which can be transferable in any other parts of the UK. We start looking at the rural-urban classification from the DEFRA, which only consider the population density. And then we also looked at the road network, the public transport services available, and the potential for leveling up. In this respect, we chose the 3 areas at 3 different population density, with the lowest one being Northumberland, are mainly rural case studies. The second one is the South Somerset, which is a largely rural area when there is not urban areas nearby, and it is a mixture of medium, large towns and villages. And our higher density population case studies is Essex County Council, where you got a mixture of urban and rural at the same time. Next slide, please. So we developed next, I think you got an animation. Next slide. Next. That doesn't look my. Next slide. Thank you. Sorry. I think you got an animation built in as well, which I was not thinking to. So what we did was generating daily travel patterns for each of these areas, looking at trip chains. If you click again, you can see all the travel patterns coming from Northumberland and Essex as well. Another click, you will see that the travel patterns are very similar. So there is not a real change between what we can see here in 3 rural areas compared to what we might have in urban areas. So they're very similar. We can see that in both Northumberland and Essex, we have a close bond with the nearby urban areas, with whom they got a relationship of interdependencies. So you can't study rural areas if you don't consider also the connection between the urban areas close by and the actual urban areas. The residents tend to travel more locally, much more compared to the urban case study, and they also have much longer and complex travel patterns. If you see here, normally in urban areas you go simple too, you just go to work and come back. whilst in rural areas you've got a higher proportion of complex tools, which is between 3, 5 and 6 trips in one day. Above that, you got long-haul logistics and local logistics, which is also much more higher compared to urban areas. Not just because of the long-haul logistics, but purely for the high count trips. So that means the residents are more reliant to access the services looking at last mile deliveries. Next slide, please. So due to the findings of the mobile network data analysis, we also asked the residents what they would look like, asking what are the traditional travel patterns and what type of services they would like to see. So we ran an extensive services, online questionnaire, focus groups, and online community as well. These were done during the COVID lockdown. And we asked 1,500 people what they would like to see. Most of them, they're quite keen to innovative solutions. So the purpose of the project was looking at innovative transport services. So it's a digital DRT that we're asked to assess. And also the importance of the community services as a DRT community services, but also delivery drones and micromobility services. The on-demand transport scored really high. Next slide, please. But what was interesting is that despite the fact that you got 3 different population densities, the road network and the public transport network available was different. So, for example, Northumberland's got a much pervasive road network and better availability of public transport compared to Somerset. Those in Somerset cannot access either the bus stops or the train station by foot. And because of that, there's much more relying on cars compared to people living in Northumberland or Essex, for example, where they got an higher possibility to access the rail networks as well. So if you look at the next slide, so we got the funding on of the questionnaire. We have a really strong reliance on the use of the cars. Mostly older people are the ones that are most risk aware. They are aware that picking up new innovative mobility services at DRT could be good for the environment. Younger people are really look at innovative things to do to move around, but most of the time they're scared if they're going to change their traditional travel patterns. But they're more keen to use the digital services and booking services across various modes of transport as well. When we ask what is the most things that you really care about when you look at mobility services, they're always the replies were more traditional. They look at convenience, speed, and reducing costs. In respect with the COVID lockdown, they actually told us they would like to live more locally their places, so walking more and using less the public transport. But if you ask, would you like to take new mobility services for your current travel patterns or the one that you had before the COVID lockdown, they usually tell you that they don't feel confident in using new forms of transport and they prefer driving. So the preference for driving is the biggest barrier that you might have. Following this questionnaire, next slide, please. We also ask mobility services providers specialized in DRT deployed around the UK and more widely in Europe, what is the best feature that characterizes demand responsive transport. In the rest of Europe, they have a strong utilization rate compared to the UK. The customer experience usually is positive. They tend to collect a lot of data around the experience of demand responsive transport, and they tweak the service based on the customer itself and what they judge to be a good service or not. The customer is extremely loyal when they start to use demand responsive transport, which is confirmed from a survey that we did in 2019 for another project in the northeast of England, where residents tell us that they would love to take public demand responsive transport, but they need to know that. So the reason why the Department for Transport is providing the trials is also to remove the barriers towards the travel habits the residents might have. The value proposition usually is looking at convenient and always available transport. They also tried luxury services compared to standard services, but really what the residents loved was the fact that they avoid the congestion, they got a much quicker experience, and in general is a more environmental friendly. The average coverage of the services is important, and as such the business models that we are going to use. So if you move to the next slide, so we've done also a business case analysis. Most of the time what is important in the UK is a good utilization rate and regular repeat custom of the services. In order to increase the appetite for these services, there are various strategies that our mobility service operator are putting in place, such as events, being present in most of the focal points of the towns and villages. The business model that really works in rural areas is not the door-to-door one or the corner-to-corner business model that you might see in urban areas, but it's more the hub and spoke model. So when you get out and about and you are in a shopping center and you see the service, you more naturally tend to jump on that in order to reach home, or be available when the public transport around the bus stops or a train station. When the public transport arrives, demand responsive transport is usually a good option to extend the service of the public transport itself, which is something that we have noticed also when we did the modeling in Bristol for a demand responsive transport in the outskirts of the north of Bristol. So next slide. If you look at the benefits of the data-driven approach, we've seen that we can see all the real travel patterns in urban and rural areas. So it's an holistic study of what might be the travel patterns of the residents across a wide area and what are their preference. We can understand the connection between urban and rural much better now. And the demand for travel is equally distributed across the day. We have seen that in rural areas, actually, we move away from the traditional peak time that we got in urban areas. The peak times are very stretched. They usually last 3-4 hours. They tend to travel longer in order to reach the destination, which is much more far apart. There is a strong bond between the goods to people and people to goods. So people tend to shop online much more and travel locally over the weekends. They're traveling more for leisure. So when we asked the survey, which was a representative sample of the population, what are the most reasons for travel, they actually say it's for work and commuting. But when we look at the travel patterns and the analysis, the current travel patterns actually indicated a stable demand for travel, although it's lower compared to a urban area. So the 3 case studies told us that we don't really need to model or set up our services around population density, but we should look at how people travel around and cater for short, medium, and long trips in order to allow them to choose the correct mobility services that they would like to see. And demand responsive transport actually is a very good measure to allow the public transport services to extend the catchment area and provide and serve for much more users than the one that are reached out from the current bus services. And this allows also the public transport operators to increase the frequency in the main corridors, because they got this partnership with the demand responsive transport operators. Next slide, please. So what is the impact of this approach? Now we understand that there are no different tools for urban areas. You can use the same tools which have been generated for urban. I'm referring more to the studies around demand modeling for on-demand mobility and shared mobility that we have developed during the demand project with the Department for Transport in 2018-2019, which looked at using agent-based modeling in urban areas. The fact that we've been able to generate daily travel patterns which are quite reliable for rural areas allows us to transfer all these tools and study all types of shared mobility in integration with what might happen in urban area. Actually, all the models that we've done, there are regional models. So we're looking at transfer these between the rural and the urban areas. The local authorities can benefit from this approach because they can plan for integrated rural mobility rather than looking at specific small projects, and they can quantify the type of services that they might want to see on their area. And also this type of data-driven approach allows the SMEs to access new perspectives, identify latent demand for these services, but also allow the local authority to use the usage data that are collecting through monitoring and evaluation of these services and improve the services in an incremental way. Also, the evaluation of the business models allow them to understand how to tweak the services, especially regarding rural residents' desires, but also the travel patterns that we can see. The next steps for us is another project funded by the Department for Transport, which is looking at decarbonizing pathways. Rural areas are considered carbon-intensive areas, so most of the time the increase of last mile deliveries can be something that we can reduce, looking at assessing the connection between the consumer behavior and the transport demand modeling. So this is something that I will tell you next time. That's my last slide. Yes. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrizia. Right. I think what's set out there is that there's more information, more data available that we can use. So the number of excuses that we've got for not getting it right is disappearing rapidly. Could I ask all the panelists now to show themselves by activating their video and sound? And can I just welcome Andrew Highfield, who's Head of Integrated Transport at Hertfordshire County Council. Hertfordshire obviously writes a good bid because they were successful, one of the successful schemes in obtaining funding for a DRT from the Rural Mobility Fund. And Stuart Eccles, who is DRT supervisor at Lincolnshire County Council, which has one of, I don't think it's quite the longest lasting, but it's certainly the largest, longest lasting DRT scheme in the UK, and one that has some unique characteristics. So I hope we're going to hear about both your experiences so far. So I'm just going to kick in and start asking some of the questions that have come in for the panel. And the first one I think is certainly very relevant, particularly with comments from both Beate and Patrizia. How do you overcome potential user skepticism? This is from Sylvia Barrett. She has heard from many people who would prefer to keep their timetabled services, even if they're very irregular. They prefer that to the uncertainty of how long they might have to wait for DRT, even though in many cases it might be under 15 minutes. Put that in connection with the age profile of potential DRT users in rural areas, and do we have a problem? How do we overcome that? Beate.
I think that the issue is very much that we have existing DRT and bus users, and then we have the whole market of other people who don't use buses at the moment. And the problem with that is that you have people like me who would absolutely be horrified at having to phone someone to book a bus, whereas I think there's a demographic problem, because I talk to the same people as Sylvia too, and there are people who use buses at the moment who want them to continue exactly as they are, and there are people who don't use buses because they are the way they are. And I don't know if Patrizia wants to unpack that, or Stuart with his longest running service, and explain how he's managed to keep his longest running service going with lots of people who want to use it. But I think that the main problem is that we've got two different groups. We talk to two different groups of people who use the bus, want the bus how it is, and look at it as a fixed route thing, whereas there is a whole bunch of other people who just, that's like that they've got grown up on Uber, and they can't conceive that anyone would expect them to wait at a bus stop.
Stuart.
Yeah, I'll happily field that one. I think in terms of the shift in dynamic from people who are set on using fixed timetable routes, we found that where we were implementing DRT, we ran them parallel for a short period of time to embed confidence in the usage that it can deliver the same kind of security that the fixed route does. But equally, if you have the DRT scheme that's available for either a longer period of time or across more days, it can actually then be more flexible. And it can offer them greater variety of travel times and destinations. So we've found that if we are putting in a DRT into a new service area where we might look to withdraw a conventional service, is to run them parallel for a short period of time, and then we've found that people naturally gravitate towards the DRT model because it does offer that flexibility, and it offers them more choice about how their mobility needs can be met. It is very difficult. I accept that some people are either averse to wanting to call for a bus service, or have never had to, and it's not something that they would want to engage in. And I think that's where access to it is a very key part. Having apps available or being able to book online forms part of that confidence as well. And we've seen that when we introduced web booking 10, 15 years ago, there was a channel shift there, and that grew people's confidence. And now with us working with Padam through the app, we are seeing there's an increase in usage from the app. And I think those different options give people the confidence to use the DRT service.
Stuart, what's your age profile of users?
Predominantly it is concessionary bus pass holders. From our biannual surveys, we see that I think it's about 70% are in that region, so 65 and over. However, we do cater for a number of non-entitled scholars. We have a number of people who use it consistently for commuting to work purposes. So there is a range there, but it is predominantly those who don't have their own transport available to them, they don't drive, and it is I'd say 60 to 70% are concessionary pass holders.
Right, so this has overcome age-related skepticism, if I can.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, David.
Sorry,
you mentioned that you had schemes which were more successful in attracting younger people. How's that happened?
Obviously, outside of general aspects, like it depends on the makeup of the population of the area, but one of the key things was actually, as Stuart alluded to, is the digital tools, and especially the mobile app. So to target a younger population, so on the premise that there is a problem to get about, the younger population just it doesn't compute if you want to call a call center and book something. They want to be able to do it on their mobile phone, like they do for many other things, in their life. So I think the key thing is actually it's not the be all and end all. It's not all about technology, but it's marrying the transport service with the benefits that the technology can bring, and that's how you can bring about change.
Okay. Can I just move on to a sort of, a technical question one way, but rather fundamental. John Carr's asked about digital connectivity. And so there's a sort of issue about what the experience is in terms of 4G, 5G rollout. And to the extent that there are sort of gaps in the arrangements, is this something that the DFT is going to be able to influence in terms of priorities? But first, the experience. Stuart, did you have any black spots in terms of?
It's interesting. We do have some black spots, mostly across the wolds, where 4G can be intermittent. We do, though, have quite a number of good carriers in terms of mobile signal provision. So it doesn't appear to be a barrier to us using the technology. The vehicles we use with their onboard equipment relies on mobile signal strength, and where we do have black spots, they are intermittent to the extent that it's less than a minute or two. So it's not a big issue, and we do have some very deep rural areas that do propose natural challenges for 4G, and I say 4G in a minute. 5G in Lincolnshire is getting there, but it's not there yet. But it hasn't proved to be a barrier to using the service or the technology.
Okay, Jamie, is this an issue, live issue for the DFT?
Yeah, so I think it is an obvious issue, especially when we're talking about some of our most rural locations. So yes, there's naturally ongoing conversations between DFT and other departments to understand the agenda for making improvements in that space. And I think the other point to make is the service providers ultimately need to be making sure that there's alternative ways for booking that don't sort of restrict people to only using app-based tools. But yes, ultimately, yes, it is very much on the radar, and it's, I think, to an extent, we're at the mercy of the mobile phone and network providers. But yes, there's constant conversation going on to make sure that we can make improvements in that space.
Just one thing on that, John, if I can. Yeah. So there are two aspects to that answer as we see it. One is on, as has been touched upon, the driver technology, so the driver app. So what we do there, we work in some very rural environments where there are black spots, it's simply we have a plan B, which is in services where that is known, there is a printout of the itinerary. So obviously, what you're coming up against here is the real-time functionality is not possible. So we work with the authority in those areas to define a period of time where there's a cutoff, if you like. So in a place where there are black spots, obviously you can't offer real time because it's problematic. So it can be 1 hour before the pickup, or it can be half an hour, it could be 2 hours. We work with all kinds of different permutations on that. But you work with the authority to structure the service to minimize those problems. And as I said, on the driver side, they have a printout of their itinerary. So if there is a black spot, there is a plan B.
Okay. I want to move on to a rather more fundamental question, which Rich Darmitage has posed, and that is how DRT should be paid for. He feels that we're dancing around the subject, and this is a sort of crunch issue which tends to get forgotten about in all the technical discussions. Given the track record of DRTs in the UK, including recent DRTs in what from the outside look like perfect operating areas. I'm thinking about Pick Me Up in Oxford, which have not been able to cover their costs. And that seems to be at odds with Beate's results from the survey, where a significant proportion of people were expecting that the services would be financially sustainable. And I've seen at least 3 local authorities go out in public to say that they're expecting their Rural Mobility Fund projects to become financially self-sufficient at the end of the project. I was interested to see the Lee from Transport for Wales, responsible for the Flexi services, say recently, don't expect DRT to save you money. This is a different service and you'll have to pay for it differently. So underline that, how should we expect these new models of DRT to be financed? Andrew, I'm going to let you have a contribution.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for us, obviously, the funding helps from a DFT for the initial 4 years to help us prove that hopefully it can be self-sustainable. We are planning on that basis, but I think it's defining expectations about sustainability with finance around attracting people to the service, so it's financially sustainable just from revenue, or can we blend it into the other services we offer for entitled children, special education needs children, adult care services, dial-a-ride, all the services that the local authority provides anyway, via contracts or different mechanisms. I think that poses its own challenges, and I think it's being very clear of who we're trying to attract to the service and how. But I think that is also then respectful of the community where we're providing these services for, because I know we've talked in a number of these presentations about rural services never quite clicking for people and gaining that access to education and opportunities. But a lot of people have been trying, and there's a lot of great community transport schemes, there's a lot of great fixed bus routes. They've really tried to crack this. And I know with DRT, the technology has really come along and has improved. So I think for me, we'd like it to be self-sustainable, obviously with this scheme that we're implementing later in the year from the Rural Mobility Fund. But we also need to look at opportunities at how that sustainability looks with other services we provide and how we can layer them together to sort of appeal to all the community that we provide for.
Jamie.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that, thanks, Andrew, because I think it's worth highlighting, probably something I didn't reference in my slide deck, is that, yeah, we've got 17 different schemes being pursued by 15 local authorities. And it's fair to say that they are taking quite different approaches to making sure that these are financially viable in the longer term. As Andrew says, the funding that we're making available for these schemes is purely for the period of the trial, which, depending on the scheme, is anything from 3 to 5 years. And we were very keen that for a successful bid, it needed to articulate how they intended to make it financially viable in the longer term. And as I say, each local authority did take a slightly different approach. Some were looking at sort of taking, I guess, a more of a total transport approach and thinking of opportunities for consolidating services to sort of guarantee that demand almost. Some were looking at engaging with local businesses to ensure that there's that they're providing a service to companies, organisations that may be able to contribute to the cost of those. And equally, there is a bit of an elephant in the room here, which is that that we are asking, in broad cases, we are asking DRT services to service areas of the UK that aren't naturally commercially viable, and if we were to put a timetabled service in the same space, that too wouldn't be viable. So what we're very keen on, as I say, in the National Bus Strategy, is to encourage that close working between the local transport authorities and the bus operators to identify those models, those opportunities that work as part of the wider bus service provision. And use the funding available that sort of optimises the chance of that DRT solution being a permanent fixture rather than just a sort of a fleeting pilot or trial.
Stuart, DRT as part of your overall public transport support budget, it's a significant proportion, and you've managed to maintain that for a number of years, including continuing the political support. How have you managed to do that?
I think early doors, we made it a pivotal part of what our public transport offer was going to be. We made sure that it was embedded in our strategy, and that we kind of committed to that ethos early on. We worked heavily with commercial providers along the main trunk routes, and looked to provide access for rural communities into those trunk routes, and had an integrated approach. And the fact that the satisfaction of those using it and the number of people travelling continued to grow gave enough weight of argument that this, for our location on our geography, actually makes sense. If we were to look at it now and thought, and taking, let's say we took a DRT away and tried to replicate what we have with conventional services or fixed routes, it would cost significantly more and provide arguably a less of a service. So we know that it is going to cost a significant chunk, probably up to about 50% of our public bus fund to do it. But in terms of bang for buck, it provides so much more for us in the areas that we've got than a conventional service would ever do. I think one of the other things that is key here is that the service has evolved over the 20 years that we've had it, and it has shifted with times and in terms of what people need it to do. We've seen that there is greater need to use the vehicles and the services there for other purposes. So it's not just a public bus service. It does fulfill the role that some potentially CT things would do. It provides greater options for those who have mobility needs and probably couldn't access a conventional service. But equally, we recognise where, as Jamie said, it couldn't stand on its own 2 feet in terms of being viable. If there isn't enough demand there, we've looked to work with adult social care, home to school movements, as Andrew highlights, because at the end of the day, you have a finite asset that you can use. So it can be DRT for the majority of the day, but in order to help cross-subsidise it, we can work with other parts of the council to use that vehicle to bring, I suppose, money into transportation from other areas, and makes it more financially viable. And so having that model and moving and adapting the service as we go along is how we've managed to keep it sustainable and viable, and a good use of the public transport funds that we have available to us.
Okay. I think that was really helpful. It raises a whole number of other questions, which I was spread out. Particularly there, you mentioned the overlap as part of, I suppose, the total transport approach that you're suggesting. The overlap with community transport. And obviously there are a lot of community transport schemes around which run very effective demand responsive transport, in the sense that they are dial-a-ride services and people are phoning up and getting a service on demand. So how do those services interact? Because I'm not assuming that
I think
it's going to replace community transport. What's the overlap and how does that work?
So I think Lincolnshire might be quite unique in the sense that its community transport is minimal, and it was never a really strong part of the market. So the overlap is actually quite small. The DRT, the dial-a-ride services that Lincolnshire had that were funded by the local authority went through a major review in 2010. So we had a look at all the services it was providing, the users that were there, and looked to see whether they could transfer to our DRT network, which is the Call Connect service. And by and large, it was possible to shift that whole user base onto our public DRT service and still provide the same level of service and mobility options that was required. So our dial-a-ride service and the traditional ones that were there morphed into our DRT option. So whilst DRT can be seen as purely a public transport or public bus offer, ours is a little bit more nuanced, and it caters for both your traditional bus user and those who would use what is a traditional dial-a-ride. So it is a hybrid of the two, and that's arguably what makes it work, because it can fulfill both needs. It can wear both those hats quite comfortably under the same single service, rather than having it as two distinct needs. And so the fact as well, I think that our CT service is quite limited, does assist, but it does provide a clear strategy and a clear offer to passengers. You've got a single service rather than, say, a DRT bus service, a dial-a-ride, a CT. And if you're a member of the public, it is quite confusing. Then, do you use CT to get to your hospital appointments, dial-a-ride to get to your community engagements, and then do you go shopping on a DRT? And I think having a clear and consistent offer makes it easier for people to access it and understand what it is that you want to provide for them.
Beate, was that an issue in terms of your research?
I think what this is pointing to is kind of like a much wider and bigger issue, and hopefully one that the National Bus Strategy and Enhanced Partnership / Franchising can address. And that's, if you're running a massive double-decker bus with peak fares, you can fill it. You have one driver and 90 seats, or you can fill it with people. You can whereas if you've got a minibus, which most of our DRT services were, you've got one driver, same cost base, not a great deal of difference in the vehicle cost, but you've got up to 25 seats. And so you're always going to have a slightly different cost base and business proposition, because maths, there's that you can't have that massive peak collecting lots and lots of fares on a DRT service. It has to be much more of a tailor, cutting your cloth to fit your customer base type service. And I think that part of the issue is that we need to recognise, as Jamie was saying, that these are rural areas. As Patrizia was saying, they are rural areas with less peak demand in general, and smaller numbers of people travelling. So the maths for a DRT has to be quite different to the traditional profitable fixed bus routes, and we need to probably look at a much more broader area-based funding model, because where DRT is bringing customers effectively to the profitable fixed bus routes, it's enhancing their passenger base as well as being a service for people that gives them transport at their origin that enables them to get to their destination. So I think we're in a period of change, and some of the answers I got in the survey I think possibly don't quite reflect that. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to repeat this in a year or so when we know a bit more about how enhanced partnerships and franchising works.
I'm going to pass a legal barrier.
I was going to pass to you, Patrizia. Go ahead.
There is also a legal barrier between that define the community services and the DRT. When we run the interviews with mobility services provider, they actually told us that they can't operate on the same license, a DRT services and a community-based services. Most of the customers recognize the value of the DRT, but at some point the DRT stops operating because it's not commercially viable anymore. At that point, the community transport usually pick up the same passengers, so same customers. The DRT operators would like to continue the services, but there is a legal barrier that prevents them to run community-based services in certain time of the day because their license does not allow us, and this is allow them. And this is something that the DFT was not aware before that, so it can be removed and looked at when we consider the demand responsive transport and the community base.
So I'm conscious of time here, and that does suggest a step up challenge for both local authorities and community transport for them to step up and start operating full-scale DRTs. I've got a final question for everybody, and it's almost a yes/no because we're out of time. Should we be thinking about DRT as a premium service or not? Patrizia.
No, it's an extension of the public transport in rural areas.
Thank you.
And
absolutely not.
Radical agreement here. This is something get to their homes and businesses and appointments.
Fine. We have universal agreement. Okay, which is a good note to end. Look, we've learned a lot today. Can I say thank you very much to the panelists and to Landor and to Padam Mobility for assisting in setting up today's webinar. I hope that those people who are attending have learnt from this, and just be assured that the organisers will be sending out the papers to everybody who's registered. So thank you very much, and have a good day for the rest of your working day. Thank you.